Let's see how to select stitches on our machine. This is your stitch selector dial, and you turn your stitch selector dial until the stitch you want to sew lines up with this dot marking on the main part of the machine. We're going to sew a regular straight stitch in center needle position. Our stitch length is already at number 2. Place your fabric under the presser foot, lower the presser foot lifter, and step on the foot control to start sewing. When you come to the end of the fabric, turn the hand wheel toward you till the needle is all the way up and just begins to come down. And then raise the presser foot lifter and cut your thread. So there's our basic straight stitch. Let's turn the stitch length dial now and see what it looks like when we sew our straight stitch with a longer stitch length setting, which you might do for top stitching or sewing with thicker threads. So here you can see the difference between the shorter stitch length and the longer stitch length. Next, let's try the multi-stitch zigzag. So we'll turn this dial until the multi-step zigzag lines up with this dot on the main part of the machine. Toward you till the needle is all the way up and just starts to come down. Raise the presser foot lifter and trim your threads. Now these stitches are really far apart because our stitch length dial was set at a long setting from the previous stitch we had done. So if we want to bring these stitches closer together, let's make that stitch length a little shorter. I'll bring it down to a 1 this time. Toward you, raise the needle out of the fabric all the way up and just starting to come down. Raise the presser foot lifter, cut your threads. With the stitch length setting at a smaller number, it looks completely different. The multi-step zigzag is a great stitch for elastic insertion, but it can be used decoratively or even for a seam finish. Next, let's try our scallop stitch. We'll turn the stitch selector dial, until the scallop stitch is lined up with this dot marking on the front of the machine. Raise the needle out of the fabric. Presser foot lifter to take your sewing out and trim your threads. And there's our beautiful decorative scallop stitch. If you wanted to bring those stitches even closer together, you can just shorten your stitch length even a bit more. All the way up and just begins to come down. Raise the presser foot lifter and cut your thread. And there's our scallop stitch with an even shorter stitch length setting. So just use your stitch length dial to adjust the stitch as you wish for your project, and you can experiment with different colors of threads, different types of threads, and just have fun with it. So next, let's take a look at the zigzag stitch. This one's a little different. When you look at it on your stitch selector dial, it looks like it goes from narrow to wide all in one setting, but it actually means that you can go from wide to medium to narrow and any place in between, as long as you line it up for the size you want to make it with the dot marking on the machine. Let's set it for the widest setting, lined up with the marking on the machine, and see what that looks like. Turn the hand wheel to raise the needle up to its highest position and just begin to come down. Lift the presser foot lifter and cut your threads. And there's our widest zigzag setting. Now let's turn the stitch selector dial to maybe more of a medium setting within the range that it shows on the dial, and line that up with the marking on the machine. And step on the foot control to start sewing. Sure the hand wheel turns toward you and raise that needle all the way up until it just starts to come down. Raise the presser foot, cut your threads. So you can see that I went from the widest setting to a narrower setting here, simply by turning the dial. Let's try one more where we bring it down on the dial to a very narrow setting, lining that up with the dot marking on the machine. Up until it just begins to come down. Raise the presser foot lifter, cut your thread. Here you can see it even narrower still. So now we've seen how to change the width of our zigzag, but what if we wanted to change the distance between the stitches, meaning making them closer together or further apart? Let's put it on the widest zigzag setting and put our stitch length dial on 4, just to see how that looks. So here you can see the width of the zigzag is the same, but the distance between the stitches is longer here because we put the stitch length setting to a longer number. Now let's do the opposite and turn it all the way down, maybe somewhere between the 0 and the 1, and that's going to make our stitches very close together. Toward you to make sure the needle is out of the fabric, and cut your thread. So there we have the widest zigzag setting with a very short stitch length setting, and you might use that for applique. So just try various width settings and length settings with your zigzag stitch depending on the project. For more information about your machine, a full instruction manual is available on the SINER website to view or download anytime.